The views expressed on this podcast are our own and do not constitute legal advice, nor do they constitute an attorney-client relationship. They also don't represent the views of anyone's employers. Hope you enjoy the podcast.
Ready to future-proof your business with data and AI? This is Trust with Dominique Shelton-Leipzig. Conversations about navigating the complex and evolving landscape of data protection, technology, and society. Here's Dominique.
Hi, Kay Firth-Butterfield. I am so thrilled to welcome you to the Trust podcast. As former head of AI at the World Economic Forum, Kay is one of the world's top experts on the ethical governance of AI. She pioneered the roles of Chief AI Ethics Officer and Vice Chair of the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethics of Autonomous Systems. She is currently the CEO of Good Tech Advisory and a leading voice on ensuring humanity benefits equitably from AI. Kay, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
It's very exciting. So, you've had such a diverse career as a barrister, former judge, professor, technologist, and an entrepreneur. What initially sparked your interest in AI ethics and governance?
Well, people sort of say this career is so crazy, but actually I say that there is a golden thread that runs through my entire career, and that is that I've always wanted to help people. So as a lawyer, you would well know yourself, you're dedicated to helping people. And I was a human rights lawyer. So I was dedicated to helping those people who were less able to help themselves, be they children, or be they victims of violence or whatever. So when I was writing a book I did a lot of work around helping create laws on human trafficking and things like that. So I was writing a book and I got to thinking about the intersection between we as humans and artificial intelligence and machines in the future. And that was actually back in 2010. So I was a little bit ahead of myself, but the world just caught up, it seems. And so the last chapter of that book was dedicated to this sort of thought process of, what does human rights and machines and us working together mean? And of course, that sort of immediately pivoted me into the work that I do now.
Well, you were prescient, really, and so ahead of your time in terms of looking at AI governance back when you were as a human rights attorney and also in writing your book. And you've really been in a unique position to see the sort of arc of this. I guess I would like to get your perspective on what it's like today to see all these headlines on AI and what you've been studying now and mastering here for well over a decade, to now see it headline news. What are just your impressions?
Well, I can't tell you how pleased I am that everybody is now talking about these issues because, for a while I was this crazy person who talked about things that nobody actually understood. And I'd go to dinner parties and not even my friends would think I was sane. And so now it's really good that there are many more people who are really taking it seriously. And, we're beginning to see legislation come out, particularly in Europe. And I do have a sense that we might eventually get there. And that's, what I've been working towards for, as you say, over a decade now.
In terms of not just the discourse, but what's actually in practice, what are the most critical ethical issues, in your view, posed by AI today?
Yeah, so there are a number of them, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to highlight a few. I think the first is the lack of representative data. that we have. For example, if you want to use artificial intelligence to look at curing heart attacks or working on heart attacks, the principal data that's out there is on white guys over 55 living in America. That's not useful if you are actually working in Africa, for example. It's not useful if you're working in America and you want to think about women or persons of color. So the fact that the data is so skewed that generative AI is working on, it should be of huge concern, and not enough people are talking about it. Because what's happening is that we're actually seeing a sort of continuation of the way that the world was created, principally by white guys writing things down from the earliest time that we had records, and that's continued. So we have those mindsets embedded in all the information that we are requesting from the computer. And so that, I think, itself is hugely important that we have to deal with, because it's about equity, but it's also about the design of our future society. If we don't have all those voices, but we continue using generative AI to give us the answers, then we are simply embedding the problems of the past in our future. And so I think that's one thing that we really need to sit down and say, how are we going to do this? Another issue that I think is again, not talked about as much as it should be is the lethal autonomous weapons issue, and how AI is increasingly being brought into the arena of war. Obviously, I couldn't not mention the fact that in 2024, over half the world's population by GDP will go and vote. And so the potential influence of AI that is crafted to increase the divide between us and to undermine our democratic processes, that's next year. We haven't got very much time to address this problem. So that seems to me to be an issue. And I think the sort of overriding, if I brought all those three things together, the overriding thing for me is that we need to plan better than we are doing for a world with AI. We need our governments and us as citizens to actually think about, where do we want to be in 2050? And how do we plan for that? And what does humanity and what do our human rights look like in 2050? Rather than sort of drifting into a future with AI. I personally, it used to be said that AI was sort of a bit like carriages and chauffeurs, that the coachman was able to transfer really easily to being a chauffeur. With generative AI, I don't think that that's an option for us as human beings now, and we need to be a lot more thoughtful than we are being about it.
Oh my gosh, there's so much to unpack here, and every one of the things that you said is key and critical part of our society. And to imagine that we have really three and then one big overarching is enormous, and there is a lot of responsibility on all of us. So that's why I'm so excited to have you on the podcast and discuss. And on the first issue, in terms of the algorithmic fairness or algorithmic bias, but really just making sure that we're not hard coding in issues that we're trying to move past and outside of the generative AI context. We don't want to promulgate things that we've been trying to rid our society of. So I'm so curious about the opportunity to be intentional here, and your point about thinking things through, but the idea of AI for good, and maybe even in the training data and looking at how the models are trained. If a company were to discover, oh my goodness, the data that we're using for, X whenever is actually only representing one group, and we want to make sure that it's is representative of all of our customers, which, as you said, a lot of companies are global companies now, and are so many different ethnicities, political genders, etc. So could they use like synthetic data or some other, could AI be used to like basically balance itself to try to get some, representative data in the context you use, like the heart monitoring? Like, couldn't trial data be obtained somewhere that would be more diverse and then maybe create synthetic data or something to match?
Well, yes, but there are a number of problems with doing it that way. And the best data that we can have is actually the data from the person who's living in South Africa. If we don't have any data in that diaspora, then it's really hard to actually synthesize that data. So there's that problem. But, to go back to what could they do, I think there are a couple of things that companies really need to be doing. One is that this is a C-suite issue. It's not something that you just shuffle off to your chief technical officer or your chief AI officer and say, you get on with it. Because actually everybody in their silos is using AI. And so you really need to have the whole of the executive thinking about it and pushing down a need to work on AI in any area responsibly, so that, your human resources people who are using AI actually understand something around the parameters of how they buy and how they use. Because, at the end of the day, this is now considerable risk that you are bringing into your company. So that, I think, is one thing. I think the second thing is that if you're going to create a product for an old white woman like me, what you actually need is some representation of that demographic around your generally young men who are going to be creating the algorithms that then sell whatever it is to be. So what we've always said is that bringing disparate teams in around your scientists is really important, because it brings the different values, it brings the different perceptions, it brings the different ways that we see the world, whether we come from science or humanities, and it brings that humanity into what we're creating.
I love what you said about humanity and just making the diversity present with respect to the scientists creating the models and also with the representative data. And I think all of our listeners, and we do have a CEO and board member listenership, highly skewed in that direction. You can go back into your ecosystem and listen to what Kay just said, and maybe start posing some questions about what use cases you have, and do we have representative data that reflects the values of the company so that you can have an effective offering or service.
And I think the other thing, Dominique, about that is that, we debated this at Davos. I was on a panel with some CEOs, and we were all saying that if you're a CEO, your job is foresight. And if you don't understand enough about responsible AI, then you cannot do your job. But it's also true for boards. There are so many boards that have no understanding of AI, let alone responsible AI. And as a CEO, you need to be thinking about how your board is set up for success as well.
Exactly. And I must say, I know I hadn't met you yet, but I had reached out to you prior to Davos to see if we could have coffee. And I did listen to your presentation, which was so impressive and a big reason I wanted to invite you to the podcast. It's interesting that this is an awareness. One of the things that I founded over at the Watson Institute at Brown University was to bring, and invited you to that. So hopefully next year you can come. It's going to be on March 28th. Stay tuned. But, we brought together a group of CEOs and board members to just have this discussion around generative AI and their role, both from a CEO standpoint and the board standpoint, in terms of really setting the culture of trust. And that's why we call it a digital trust summit. But I think when we think about trustworthy AI and ethical uses. It's so important that, to your point, that this foresight and forecasting and that our leaders do this, not in the dark, but really thoughtfully pulling together and hearing you and Davos and just, I'm excited that they were there and on the panel with you, because that's the kind of leadership that's going to be required going forward, especially how quickly things are moving. Do you feel like we have the right balance in terms of innovation and, let's say, leadership intentionality as it relates to, let's just use generative AI right now as the emerging technology?
Yeah, I don't think we have the right balance. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's so wonderful to be able to come and talk to you and talk to your audience, because I don't think that there are enough CEOs who actually do understand where the technology is being used and what the risks are around it. And unless we actually have better education, then we have bigger risks. And so at the moment, the power is all with the big tech companies, but actually the use is all with the companies that don't necessarily create their own AI. And so have you got decent procurement regulations around how you're going to buy any of these systems? Have you thought about the data issues, your data flowing out? Because, clearly that's an issue as well. And if we then look at, so we've got the imbalance of power between the creators and the users. And we also have the imbalance of power, in my view, between the creators and governments around the world, because governments are playing catch up. And, even in the EU, where they've done much more than anybody else, they're playing catch up. And that then means that we also have an imbalance of power between the creators and people like you and me, the society.
And this is really great that you pointed this out, because the beauty that we have right now is that there's something that our listeners can actually do about this. And this is the time, it seems to me, for that kind of quick study with your company. For example, we have had inflection points in the past when SOX came around in the US, or our Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or UK Bribery Act. There were times where our CEO and board community just needed to bone up very quickly to be able to lead. And I'm excited because there are resources out there to do that. So maybe you could talk about, say there's a CEO or a board member listening thinking, I don't know what the developments are as far as the EU Draft Artificial Intelligence Act. I had no idea as a user, as a company licensing these models, that I would have separate governance obligations. What do you tell them? What resources are out there? And what could you do to help?
Yeah, sure. So, we started back at when I joined the forum to set up the AI practice. We started in 2017, and we started by producing a toolkit for boards. And whilst it's now really out of date because it's 4 years and everything, things have changed, actually a lot of the core issues that we suggested boards needed to understand and needed to be asking of their executive are still very relevant. So I would certainly suggest that people go to that, because whilst the wording is out of date, the big tables that we had, questions. Ask these questions, find out the answers to these questions. If you don't know, then find resources. All of those things are so relevant today. We also did something similar, but not in the if this, go there way, for every member of the C-suite. So we did a toolkit for the C-suite as well. So those are early, so, not generative AI, but in my view, really generative AI is just putting all the problems that we used to have on steroids. So find out what the problems are, and then understand that they're worse now. obviously, there are fabulous resources all over the place. And there are companies now that, are set up as boutique advisors for responsible AI and how to think about setting up the systems that you need in your company, which are multiple. I talked about procurement. One of the things I find a lot is the fact that a lot of companies say that they're AI companies, but actually if you dig deep, they really are not. And then I think one of the other things is that nobody wants to be left behind. And so what we find is that people are saying, well, we must use AI for this, but actually they don't need to use AI for that. But the perfectly good solution that's not risky that they could use instead of AI. So I think there are lots of things that we can help with, the independent ethics boards as well. If you know that you've got a risk, get somebody in to assess it. Whereas in 2017, there was nothing. Now there's lots of things available to people. And so, it's even more risky not to take advantage of them, in my view. That's with my lawyer hat on. Yeah.
And I first of all love everything that you just said. And, wearing my lawyer hat, I completely agree. And with the amount of resources, especially between the World Economic Forum, I know also the Conference Board has been holding a series of discussions on this topic, and so many other resources. This is something that we really think that our CEO and board member community really needs to avail themselves of. And my book on this topic will be coming out on December 26th. I'm really excited. I want to send you a sneak.
Congratulations.
At a time. I'd like to get your point of view on it. But we're just going into a conveyor belt of activity, not just with the technology, but with regulators too. And more importantly, I think customers and business partners are looking at companies and how they react. You talked about human rights at the beginning, but with AI, do you see any positives that can come out to assist with human rights issues, or any risks?
Obviously, I can see the positives. I think that, one of the problems of being this person who talks about the risks is that people think, oh, she's a bit of a Luddite. She doesn't believe in AI, but that's not true. I do. I think the possibilities for artificial intelligence to make our lives better are enormous. All I want to do is to sort of think about policy today that backs us into having a great future with AI. And it's that segment that seems to be so missing at the moment, because we're all reacting to the problems rather than planning. As an example of human rights problems, we're beginning to use AI in our schools. Many children are being given toys that are allegedly educational toys using artificial intelligence. But parents and grandparents are all buying them thinking this is really good for our kids. And yes, it's really important because they will work beside AI all of their lives. But do they know where the data goes? Do they know what the educational content is? Those are the sort of things that aren't actually shown on the box. And the majority of those toys come from China, for example. The toys often have facial recognition in them. We don't know where the data is stored. We don't know what practices are around safe use of data. So those are the sort of things that, we really need to get a grip on, because our children's rights are potentially being affected by that. In Germany, they actually banned one of those toys. It was a toy called My Friend Carla, and they banned it as a spying device because of the way that the insecure connectivity, which of course allowed somebody to break into it, and then who knows what messages the children are getting. So there are those sort of human rights issues that we're just beginning to uncover, and we need to act fast. Equally, I fully expect that by the time I'm old, I will be cared for by robots. I would like AI-enabled robots. I would like to have some say now in thinking about the design, the data issues, the way that we are cared for. Those are the big societal human rights issues that we need to get a grip on. It's also really important because if, as some people are saying, there is a possibility of sentience in these AI systems, then we should really have thought of what our human rights are part of a conversation with a machine and its rights. If we think about the geopolitical situation, the geopolitical situation affects every business, we've seen that AI actually allows dictatorships rather than democracies to thrive. And that's a potential problem for not only us as humans, but also for business.
Yes, and you said, I guess I hadn't appreciated that over half the world's population will be voting, and just a year from now, a little over a year from now, it's sort of astonishing and something that we all need to be aware of. It also makes me think of the importance of this issue, not just to our businesses, but everyday lives, aging family members, children. We all have them in our lives in one way or another. But the point that really resonated with me is when you talk about having a say-so, it's incumbent on all of us to be part of this conversation. And the steps that we take today are going to really have far-reaching outcomes, it seems, later. And I want to get your take on this. You've seen so much. You've seen the evolution of this. It helped basically set up the World Economic Forum's first group on this topic. Been studying it over a decade. Where do you think things will go in AI in the next, say, 10 years? And what progress do you hope to see?
So I think that the use of AI will become ubiquitous in our lives. And the progress that I would like to see before that happens is that we have better education of our population to understand the good, what it can do for us, and the bad. So let me take the example that I was told at a healthcare conference of the ER doctors using ChatGPT to check their diagnosis. Given the press around ChatGPT, you would imagine that that's a totally innocuous thing to do. And you would imagine that probably the C-suite had not thought about writing directions for their ER doctors. But actually, those of us who know about this know how very dangerous that use of it would be without more checks. And so I think it's that if I had, the proverbial magic wand and I said, how would we get from here to there? It would be a better education of understanding the tools that we are going to be using. So in 10 years' time, what I would like to see is that we understand the tools, we have decided what our society should look like, and how we deploy those tools. So it's just a small order.
Our work is cut out for us. Kay Firth-Butterfield, so thankful for you being on the podcast and for sharing these important insights. I'm excited to get this out to our CEO community. And Kay, I just want to thank you, CEO of Good Tech Advisory, for spending some time with me today, as busy as AI is, to share these insights with our CEO and board member audience and other leaders listening. I hope that they will take this back and implement in their organizations.
Well, me too, Dominique. And thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure.
This has been Trust with Dominique Shelton Leipzig. If you want to future-proof your business's investments in data and AI by adopting data leadership in privacy, security, and trusted AI legal frameworks, go to DominiqueSheltonLeipzig.com. Trust, responsible AI, innovation, and data leadership is a production of Forbes Books.